This video is intended to give new RMSP or Resource Modeling Solutions platform users an introduction to the documentation and examples that are available to them as they perhaps engage in self-training or even as an ongoing reference. The RMSP documentation is intended to provide lots of examples, both bite-sized, small pieces relating to individual functions or classes, as well as larger workflows contained within Jupyter Notebooks. This video will conclude with an introduction to opening a Jupyter Notebook, opening one of these examples. All of the examples within the documentation are available locally on your machine after installing RMSP. You do not need to use a Jupyter Notebook to execute Python and execute RMSP. It is a very popular method, however, just because it has, as we will demonstrate particularly in the next video, lots of ability to embed annotation with working code, with output figures and tables. And so it's a useful method particularly for prototyping workflows and provides a nice transparent archive of the results. This guide is not intended as a installation guide per se, but if you have not yet installed installation, we'll make mention of that now and how to find those instructions. If we go to our Resource Modeling Solutions platform portal, you should see various tabs at the top here: Courses, Software, Documentation. If we go into the Software tab, we see the installation that's available for both installing RMSP itself, as well as installing RMS Python, which is basically a command prompt. The background Python packages essentially that RMSP requires to run. And so you'll want to download both of these, and then if we go now to the documentation, here's the landing page. The installation instructions for using those files we just highlighted may be found here. And so for Windows and Linux, if we go to Windows, we see the step-by-step screenshots of how to proceed through the installation. Looking at the broader documentation, if we go down past installation, we have a Getting Started. And this may actually be useful for users that have more Python background and really kind of want to get into RMSP specifically and don't need to learn about Jupyter and Python at a slower pace that I'll be going through here. You may consider going into this Getting Started and going to perhaps running your first notebook, actually rather Getting Started notebook. So here's our first notebook, and this jumps pretty much right into using RMSP and doesn't really have anything to do with Python instructions, which is what I'm going to start with in the next few videos within this series. And so this may be more, if you're finding I'm going too slowly, perhaps consider simply installing RMSP and then checking out this Getting Started notebook. I do want to note at the top, you see the following notebook may be accessed in the RMSP distribution if users wish to execute and modify it, and then it provides the file name. And so we'll look at that in a couple minutes and basically where this notebook may be found on your machine. And since it's on your machine, you can experiment with it. You can consider extending it to your work, and it's just a useful reference for playing around and becoming comfortable with the system. Looking through our first notebook, and we'll obviously get into much more detail, particularly starting in the next video. But for now, it may just be worth taking a quick look at what a notebook is. We see annotation, bolded lists. It looks almost kind of like a report style formatting, and that's one of the advantages of Jupyter Notebooks. We see working Python code. Specifically, we're importing some packages there. We can load some data. We can look at the data in a table format. We can execute more Python code to generate an inline figure, in this case looking at a cross-section of the data. And so this is what a Jupyter Notebook looks like, and we'll again get into much more detail with this starting in the next video. Although we will open our first one at the end of this video. Coming back into the docs, we see, looking at this table of contents, that there are release notes. So tell you details as we release new versions. Licensing information, troubleshooting, and support. Configuration But then starting from here, we basically get into categories that you may look at on more of a day-to-day basis as you work with RMSP and need to look up references of, what functions and classes you need to use or how to use them. And so data management, geodata frame, point data, referring to kind of the essential class. We do most of our geostatistics using point data. But there's other types of data. We have color data, survey data, interval data. You may combine those 3D surveying, compositing. With grids, you have regular grid data, you have subgrid data. So these are different objects for handling different data types, and specifically different spatial data types. We also then have meshes, or if you have a closed mesh, a solid. We have then getting into the more away from the data and more into the statistics end of things, functions for working with univariate statistics, multivariate statistics, forming representative distributions, declustering, variograms, categorical geostats, data transformations, estimation, simulation, simulation post-processing, mining specific functions, and then we have some plotting utilities and the Center for Computational Geostatistics Interoperability. Not a big category, but we do work with our close partners at the CCG, and so therefore have functions basically for I/O, for input and output into their system, as well as executing, if you wish, their programs. We have some numerical recipes down here for kind of specific oddities that you may end up having to work with. And finally, we get into the geostatistical course notebooks that I want to draw your attention to mainly. And this is a series of notebooks that at least originated within the May 2020 courses. And within this series of training videos, I'm going to be specifically working through Fund 0 Python Intro, shown here, as well as Fund 1 Stats. And so this series of videos will go through these first two, and then we encourage users to continue on through those fundamentals if these are at about the right pacing for yourself. This first video, or this first notebook rather, will introduce Jupyter, introduce Python, and introduce the Python packages. And then Fund 1 Stats is where we'll actually start using RMSP itself. And so again, if I want to find this file, I will go to my Windows Explorer, and after you've installed RMSP, you should have selected a path basically where I'm looking at now, this RMSP folder that has a documentation and an examples subdirectory within it. If we look at the documentation folder, I basically see a local version of the documentation that we've been looking at. And so, for instance, if I click on this overview, this will load up, as you see here, looking at this path here, that's just a local version of the exact same documentation that we've been looking at. And so this could be useful if you are on a plane and simply don't have access to your RMS portal, that you always have the documentation with you. More significantly right now, we're going to go into this examples folder, and here I see notebooks associated with the documentation that we've been looking at. And so all those notebooks that were embedded within the docs, these are the actual working files. The working files themselves are these .ipynb, which are IPython notebook, and they're associated HTML. And so this is the actual working script. It has embedded markdown annotation that you can edit. It has Python code cells that you can edit. We'll talk more about that, but it's the actual working file that will generate results. Once you've finished with your script, you simply export the final results, the final code, the final figures it may have embedded, and it'll all appear within this HTML. And so you need to have Python installed on your machine, RMSP installed on your machine to run all of these files. But you can always export your results and then share them freely with other colleagues that don't necessarily have Python or RMSP. And so if you wish to, in a transparent manner, share your results with your colleagues, you simply could email these files. So just opening up one of them, again, we see kind of our alternating markdown annotations and code cells and inline results. And so this could be readily shared with anyone you wish. And so right now we're going to open up our first notebook, and specifically it's going to be this Fun0 Python intro file here. And so to do that, at least one way we would recommend is to go to your start button or little search bar here and type in RMS, and you can see it auto-completing at the top here to Anaconda prompt, so you maybe have to keep going. RMS-Python is the full one, and press enter. And so we see that by default this command prompt is opening up within my users directory, rmbar. I want to navigate the command prompt to this location I'm highlighting within my Windows Explorer where I have my notebooks. And so I'm going to Control-C to copy that path I'm highlighting. And then coming back to my command prompt, press CD space Control-V and enter. And I now see that my little flashing cursor resides within my examples directory. I'm now going to type Jupyter, J-U-P-Y, not I, T-E-R, Notebook, N-O-T-E-B-O-O-K, and press enter. And after doing that, we now see the same content that we were looking at previously within the Windows Explorer. And I'm going to now click on that Fun0 Python intro.ipynb. And so this will now move us from what was the Jupyter landing page displaying all the files to we're now looking at this individual notebook, the content of which we'll go through within the next video.